Hey friend, in this tutorial, I am going to be teaching you how to paint a detailed, realistic watercolor rose. There is going to be a full-length, more detailed, step-by-step version of this video. And then we'll also have a still step-by-step, but it'll be sped up. So if you'd rather get to all the points quickly, then you'll want the sped up version. They're both gonna have my instructions. One will be sped up, one will not be sped up. This is the full-length version. We're not going to speed anything up. It's going to be the actual time, in real time, whatever. But if you'd like to watch the other one, the sped up version, we'll link to it. So if you're ready, let's do this. Okay, so for this tutorial, we are painting a realistic style rose. I am going to break it down as simply as I possibly can for you, even if you're towards the more beginner level with watercolor. I do believe that this type of painting is doable, and it just requires a lot of patience. But the way we're going to break it down is by basic shapes first. And we're going to take each petal as its own individual painting. And if you're really patient, I think, will be quite surprised with your outcome. So, slightly different approach than maybe if we're looking at an actual visual or photograph of a rose. I have pulled up just Google image David Austin rose, which are my favorite types of roses. They're really fluffy. They kind of look very similar to peonies. And so these photos, there's David Austin. Hi, David. These roses are really fluffy. I'm going to do one that's a little bit less fluffy. And so I'm not going to be referencing a photo, letter by letter. I'm just going to be using basic shapes and then the colors in this image for reference. So I have my darkest tones are this really deep pinky purple color. My mid-tones are just a little bit, I have a few mid-tones in between there. And then my highlights are like the palest pink, ever. So I'm going to zoom in on this for my color reference. And the angle of the rose I'm going to do is this kind of pointing up cone shape. So when you think of how a flower grows, a rose is going to be attached to the stem. Obviously, it's going to start as a ball. And then as that flower starts to bloom and unfold, the bottom or bases of all the petals are still connected to the stem because obviously that's where it's growing from. But they start to just kind of fold out and lay out. So your outer petals are going to be you're going to see more of the face of the petal. And then towards the center of the flower, you're going to have smaller and tighter petals, but they're all going to point back to that stem. So you want to think of the shape of your rose when you're viewing it from the side like this, kind of like a cone. And so our opening of that cone is going to be the tops of these outer petals. So you're going for the circular shape with all of your petals pointing back to that stem. It's going to make a whole lot more sense once we start sketching. So I have a 4B pencil. You can use a 2B, an HB pencil, something that's really light. And typically before I paint in watercolor, I am sketching very, very light just so I can see the outlines of all of my petals. I'm going to be sketching a little bit darker today so that you can actually see it in the video. If I sketch super duper light like I typically would, you wouldn't see the sketch show up at all in the video. So I'm going to sketch a little bit darker than I typically would, and then I would just take an eraser and lighten the sketch a little bit. One tip for sketching, if you're not very comfortable with sketching, let's just pare it down. We're going to be sketching ovals to start, and that's it. That shouldn't be too intimidating, but again, if this is your first time sketching like this, then it might be confusing. You might get in your head, you might get a little lost. So just try to be as broad with your ovals as possible. So if my overall shape for this rose is pointing up to the right, kind of towards this edge right here, I am going to start with smaller ovals for my first row of petals. I'm not adding any contour to the edge of these petals just yet. I'm just getting in my ovals. So start with one oval, and as you come to the base of that oval, we're just going to pull out another one, and we're always going to loop back to where the stem would be. Okay, so we have just pulling out ovals and looping around. Some ovals are flatter than others because this would be like the back of a petal. And we're not going to use all of these ovals. This is just going to kind of give us a reference of where some petals would go, and then I'm going to start pulling them out once I see the shape. Again, I would not be sketching this dark normally, but we can erase it. Okay, so now it looks like a bunch of squiggles and a bunch of ovals on my paper. I'm not going to add in all of these, not all of these ovals are going to be petals. This is just basically to get the shape formed, and I'm not referencing an image to get it exactly like the image again. I'm just using my photograph as color reference. But right here, I can already tell that this petal right here is the closest one to me. And I am just going to throw in some C-curves. So basically what I'm doing for my petal contour is just C-curves. And then I can throw in some lips, some details. Like so. But they're very smooth outlines. I'm not sitting there really tightly with my pencil gripped like I'm about to throw a rock and doing every little detail on the edge of the petal. I'm kind of doing a more smooth look to the petals. And then adding in little lips here and there. So we have our first little petal. I'm going to keep going and just following the outlines. I'm trying to be as smooth with my C-curves as possible and making sure all of my petals come back to and point to this right here where the stem will be. So see how I'm ignoring this oval right here? Kind of want to start getting really big with the surface of my petals. For these lips on my petal, some of my petals, I'm just doing, here's my petal, S curve. now start to look at how your rose is filling out. I might add in another petal right here, just a little peak of one. Because it was starting to feel like a star, too much like a star. And then where our ovals are all connecting back to is right here. We're gonna pull our stem out like a C curve, like so. I might have a leaf poking out here. C curve. Then at the end of that C curve, we're gonna do an S curve to another C curve. S curve, C curve. The sketch is really dark, so it shows up in the video, but I typically would sketch much lighter than this, so I'm going to use an eraser and try and lighten this as best as I can. A gummy eraser would be best, so it doesn't smudge everywhere. But you definitely want to get rid of your ovals underneath your sketch. Okay, so I would still want it to be lighter than that, but it's not getting any lighter. So we're just going to work with it. But do sketch much lighter than you think you should. Just light enough so you can barely see it, because we are gonna have some really, really light highlights. Like this is basically white on this petal over here with just a touch of pink to it. So if you want really, really light highlights, you're gonna want a super duper light sketch. But this will just show you the step-by-step and you'll see some of the pencil, but just make sure you sketch a little bit lighter. All right, so I'm done with my pencil. I'm now, because I have such a large flower, I'm going to probably take my size 16 brush and we are going to load it up with a really light mixture of opera rose and a touch of ultramarine violet. And mostly water, because this is we're going to cover the whole area of the flower. We're going to cover the whole area of the flower with a really light wash of this mixture. So just a touch of pigment, mostly water. And so areas of our highlights would be like where there's this lip, where it's folded over. Darker shadows are going to be in these tighter areas and little corners where there's a lot of overlap happening. So you want to make sure that your highlight is super duper light on these folds or these lips folding over, and much darker towards the center here in areas that are more tucked in. So I'm going to start with most of my pigment in this area, and then I'm going to grab more water and just kind of start to fill it in. So really light on this top fold up here. I want to make sure to work quickly so that it stays wet. So I'm going to go back into some of these areas and poke in some yellow and some darker pink purple color for wet and wet blending. So the thing with watercolor, if you're brand new to it, I have a bunch of tutorials on wet and wet painting and the difference between wet and wet and wet on dry. But if you're new, watercolor blending or diffusing of color happens when two areas of pigment or water are wet and touch each other, and they will create a gradient look. So really soft, diffused blend. And that's where the magic happens with watercolor. If you're working wet on dry, you're obviously working with dry layers of watercolor. And that will give you more hard lines. So I'm gonna just drop in some of this here and move it around in these tiny circular motions, kind of like what you do with a toothbrush when you're brushing your teeth. Now I've got some lemon yellow deep, and I'm just gonna poke it in on some of these lighter edges. I want it lighter than that. And again, blending it. So on these highlight areas where I know I'm not gonna touch it much more, I'm just going to add a touch of yellow. I might even grab a little bit of yellow green, because sometimes you see that fresh, bright green look. So lemon yellow deep and a touch of sap green. Couple more spots with this yellow, and then we're going to wait for it to dry, and we're going to start adding in our deeper colors. Okay, our base layer is done. Now we have to wait for this to dry, and we're going to start working with wet on dry. All right, so now I'm going to use my size 6 brush, and we are going to start plugging in our darkest shadow tones so that we can really start to see our highlights come out, start to pop, isolate our highlights. And so we are going to be working wet on dry, so we want to make sure that we're avoiding petals that are right next to each other until one of the petals dries, and then we can go in on the other petal that's right next to it. I'm mixing up Opera Rose, a touch of Ultramarine Violet, and a touch of Lemon Yellow Deep. And I want this mixture to be thicker than the base layer, obviously, because this is going to be more opaque, it's going to be darker. So the thicker the mixture, the darker it's going to be, or more opaque it's going to be. So I'm going to start with my petals in here, avoiding my little lip fold over section. We're just going to pull out these highlights by painting in our darkest tones. I'm gonna add a little bit of water for some wet and wet to have this gradual fade to this top edge of the petal. There's our one. I'm just gonna vary the hue of each petal a little slightly, especially the further away from the center I get. So I'm gonna start at the top of this petal here with a really dark line, and then rinse off most of that pigment and dry off my brush so it's not too wet. And then bring that up with just some water. So it's a gradient. Like so. So these aren't touching. I'm not going to do this petal right behind the one I just painted because then it would just become one big blob. So I'm now going to move to this petal. Maybe this one is mostly pink opera rose and a touch of lemon yellow deep. So got my dark color laid down, then grabbing just mostly water on just a slightly damp brush to pull out that color for a gradient. And if something is looking too dark, like for example, if I want the top edge of this petal to be a little bit lighter, I can just dry off my brush really well and soak that up. Let's come up to this petal. So we're treating each petal individually like its own individual painting. So when you look at the whole flower by itself, as a whole, I mean, it can be very overwhelming, especially if you've never painted like this before. But instead, it's helpful to just look at each petal like its own painting. So now I've got a little bit more water in my brush and less pigment. I'm just pulling this darker color up the face of this petal. And I want this highlight, this edge of this petal to be really, really light. So I want to make sure to get really washy, really light quickly so it doesn't get too dark. And we can see that yellow underneath it. But I'm working quickly so that I can have this gradient blend using wet and wet painting. And I might go in on the top and just add some little pink dots while it's still wet. And kind of blend it. here. And then under this lip area is going to be shadow because it's being overlapped. So we're going to get light on this edge over here. And then I'm going to grab that darker color again and outline that edge. And then pull it out with more water. We're going to need this shadow behind this petal to be really dark because this petal in front of it, that highlight edge, is a little bit darker. So we want them to look like separate petals. Might go in with some Scarlet Lake and Opera Rose to really punch it. We've got some more overlap at the top of this petal, so I'm going to go under that edge so it blends. basically we're just repeating the same steps for every petal, switching up the hue slightly per petal so it's not the same exact thing, but trying to stay similar. And now this petal right here, we're seeing the back side of it, and it's probably going to be the most lit of the petals. So I'm just going to grab a touch of Opera Rose and a touch of Lemon Yellow Deep and start at the bottom edge of the petal here, and rinse off my brush, and then with a damp brush just pulling it up for a smooth blend. Might go in and add some yellow. Some more pink. Getting very close. As I mentioned, it does take a lot of patience. Gonna dry off my brush here and make sure this blends smoothly. There's a little too much water over in this area, so it was starting to pull that pigment in a stream. So you want to make sure when you are adding water to diffuse the colors that you're not adding too much, because it'll start to create weird streaks and hard lines. And I might kind of drag this pigment up for little subtle vein details in the flower. Now we're gonna paint in some of these lips. Same idea as all the other petals, but we're gonna basically just work with midtones and highlights and not shadows, midtones, and highlights. So I'm gonna grab some of this pigment I have and rinse just a little bit of it off and make sure I dab my brush on the paper towel so it's not too wet. We're gonna work with this bottom edge that's curving away from us and work lighter. So I'm gonna rinse off my brush now, dry it off so it's just a little damp. And just a soft pink gradient from dark or mid-tone to light. Maybe go up to that edge and darken it a little bit more while it's still wet. Not that dark though. So I'm gonna soak it up with a dry brush. And then same thing on the rest of these. I want to make sure that, for example, this lip here and the petal right behind it, that the petal behind it with those midtones don't match the ones on the lip. Otherwise, they'll just look like one petal. So I'm going to make sure that the folded area or the lip of this petal is much lighter than the one behind it. So I'm starting light with this one and then just going to poke in some color. Okay. Now we can move on to our leaves and stem. So I'm going to grab some sap green mixed with lemon yellow deep and a touch of water. And I am going to lay down a light yellow-green wash for this leaf, basically applying the same techniques we did for the petals, but now for the leaves. While this is still wet, I'm going to load up with just sap green and go back close to the rose at the base of the leaf and bring some of that in for my shadow. edges. And another layer of dark green, so Mars black and a touch sap green. And then moving on to another leaf that's not touching that one. Because again, it's still wet, so it'll just blend right into the next one over, making it one big blob. Sap green. And then sap green with a touch of Mars black. Okay, so if these are wet, I'm going to avoid touching these leaves for now and move on to the stem and do the same thing. I'm going to start on the left edge of that stem with my darkest yellow-green and then blend it with some water. And then go along that left edge with just a darker sap green. And now this leaf is underneath that one, so I'm going to start, instead of starting with lemon yellow deep and sap green, I'm just going to start with sap green by itself. So a little darker of a base. and a little more Mars Black. And sap green for this edge right up against the leaf. And we'll do the same thing for this leaf since it's overlapped. Getting lighter as the leaf gets out there on its own. So adding water and pulling out that green. And now we're going to add our darkest green with Mars Black and a touch of sap green right there where it's being overlapped. And this leaf up here is a little off on its own, so we can do some lemon yellow deep and sap green. And we're gonna have a little fold situation, so I'm going to wait for that to dry. But it'll be dark under here where we're going to have a fold, so it's going to cast a shadow. Now I'm going to grab my size 2 brush. I'm going to add little details in the leaves and in the petals. So I'm going to grab Mars Black and some sap green. More green than black for this leaf here, and then more black than green for this one. So it shows up, but you want them to be related hues and just a touch darker, a value darker or a couple values darker than what's underneath it, so that it's not too high in contrast. So I'm going to test it real quick. And we're just basically, I'm going to add more water as I pull that out. We're just basically going to add in some veiny details. I'm going to grab water now and go along that edge. So I'm just grabbing this middle vein with water on my brush and just pulling out really thin strokes. So I have a vertical hold on my brush.
Can I say something?
Yes.
It's weird that you're this good. Because you just like picked up watercolor out of nowhere. Just did it on your own. And it's weird.
That's very kind. Okay, so this edge is still wet. So I'm not going to do that fold just yet. I'm going to move on to some of these petals. And I'm going to add some details. I'm not going to do this on every petal. Just subtle, subtle vein details. So grabbing a mid-tone mixture of the same hue or color that is the base layer. So this one's got a little bit of yellow in it. I'm just going to make it slightly darker than the base layer. Starting in the direction that the edges are going is the direction you want these veins to go. So as it starts to get to the middle, you're going to start switching your directions. So on the left side of this petal, there's C curves going this way. The right side is C curves going that way. So you don't want straight lines, you want C curves. And not everywhere on the petal. You don't want to overdo it. this top leaf. Moving this lip of this top leaf down and over that bottom dark green edge, and then adding in some dark green to this top ledge to show a fade. And voila! Thanks so much for watching. I hope you had a really great time painting a realistic watercolor rose. I don't get to paint realistic style flowers that much anymore because I have a 2-year-old and we work from home, and it's a little challenging to get such a long length of time. So we did film this at night post bedtime for Miles, my son. I hope it was useful. I hope you learned something from this video. If you'd like to see another realistic floral, let me know what your favorite flower is or what you'd like to learn in this style of painting in the comments below. Let me know. The one with the most votes will probably be our next realistic floral video. So if you liked it, let me know, and the type of flower you'd like to see next, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.